Welcome to the CanMed Coffee Talk podcast, where we talk with the leading minds in cannabis science, medicine, cultivation, and safety testing. I am your host, Ben Amirault. I am the Senior Marketing Manager at Medicinal Genomics and proud member of the team that puts on the CanMed Summit. Our guests today are Dr. Emily Lindley and Dr. Rachael Rzasa Lynn. Emily is the Assistant Professor of Orthopedics and Director of the Colorado Cannabis Research Consortium. Her team's research aims to identify non-opioid alternatives for the treatment of chronic musculoskeletal pain. One such alternative that has gained increased recognition in recent years is medical cannabis, and her lab is currently studying the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids for chronic musculoskeletal pain. Rachael is a board-certified physician in pain medicine and is an associate professor in the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of Colorado, where she is the associate program director for the Pain Medicine Fellowship. Her research includes investigations in opioid pharmacology and the use of cannabis for chronic pain. Rachael and Emily co-authored a poster presented at the most recent ICRS conference titled Recruitment Challenges and Clinical Studies of Cannabis. During our conversation, we discussed how recruitment for cannabis clinical trials differs from traditional clinical trials, why prior experience with cannabis is considered a negative for patient recruitment, how legal concerns and stigma can deter cannabis-naive patients from enrolling, why the participant dropout rate is higher in cannabis clinical trials, how rescheduling may affect patient recruitment in future trials, and more. Before we get to my conversation with Emily and Rachael, I'd like to thank this episode's sponsor, the Society of Cannabis Clinicians. The Society of Cannabis Clinicians MedCan Conference offers a rare opportunity for clinicians to dive deep into the clinical realities and therapeutic potential of medical cannabis and psychedelics. Designed with healthcare providers in mind, their sessions focus on case-based learning, emerging protocols, and real-world challenges, offering practical insights that can be immediately applied to your practice. Learn more at cannabisclinicians.org and use the code CP15 to receive 15% off your registration. Okay, and without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Emily Lindley and Dr. Rachael Rzasa Lynn. Good afternoon, Rachael and Emily. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Well, I'm excited to talk with both of you today about common challenges that come with recruiting patients for cannabis clinical trials. Now, this is an important topic because it's been said many times on this podcast and at our CanMed events and all around the industry that we need more clinical data. We have a lot of great preclinical work in animal models, computer models, in vitro studies, but that clinical data in humans is really what moves the needle. And there are a lot of people doing great work, but there's still so much to do, especially because cannabinoids can be used for so many different conditions. So I think it's great that you guys are calling attention to this problem and offering some solutions for your fellow researchers. So maybe a great place to start is for you to tell us what inspired you to do this study.
First of all, this one really wasn't a true study. This is more of a commentary on where we feel like we are. And it just really came from, we have weekly lab meetings with our whole team, and we talk about where we are with our various studies. And, we kind of talk through what are the challenges with recruitment and talk with some of our colleagues and people at other institutions who do the same thing. And we thought, it's really important for us to come together and talk about it and understand what are those challenges and how maybe we can overcome those. And so we decided to put together this presentation for the ICRS.
And in addition to the studies that Emily and I run, I also serve as a study physician for some collaborators who are doing similar work, looking at cannabis for various indications. And so I've had the fortunate experience of getting to review, participant screening data as various trials are enrolling participants. And so kind of seeing some common themes across studies.
Excellent. So you mentioned that cannabis clinical trials face unique recruitment challenges. How do these differ from recruitment issues with more traditional medical studies? Rachel, why don't you take this one?
Sure. So, in general, when you're recruiting patients to be participants in a clinical trial, you're looking for people who have the particular condition or disorder that you're studying the drug in, but also to some extent who may be a bit of a clean slate or blank slate as far as prior exposure or experience with that particular therapy. If participants have previous experience for some reason with the drug that you're testing, that may bias their experience or their outcomes during the trial. If they have a history of a bad experience or ineffective treatment with something, they come in with a particular set of preconceived notions that may impact how they respond during the trial. And, for most novel drugs that come to market,
Mhm.
if they're truly new, participants haven't seen them before, and so you have that opportunity to really start from scratch. But in the case of cannabis studies, so many people out there have some prior experience with cannabis, good or bad, very rare or once or incredibly frequent. And either way, it makes it hard to enroll participants who truly represent sort of that blank slate, who can give you what you hope is an unbiased experience during the trial.
Excellent. And now, would that still apply? So, I obviously I can imagine a scenario where someone would have a previous experience with cannabis, maybe smoking it or using flower. Now, if the trial were using a tincture or a tablet or something, some other delivery mechanism for the cannabinoids, is that less of a concern, have you found?
In general, no, it doesn't matter the route of delivery. For us in many of these trials, we're really looking for people who are only using the cannabinoid that we are administering in the course of the trial. And so even if they're using a tincture and we're administering, inhaled flower, vaporized, or, conversely, if they smoke or vape routinely and we're going to give them an oral solution, they're still getting exposure to those cannabinoids on a regular basis that makes it difficult for us to tease out their response to the ones that we're administering, which
Oh,
is the
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that makes sense.
Yeah,
And
and you can
so,
imagine someone coming in if they're using regularly and then come in and versus someone who is, fairly naive and not using, you're going to see tolerance and different reactions. And so it's important that we have kind of a level playing field for participants when they come in.
yeah,
in
and then conversely, it looks like that there's also an issue for people who are maybe cannabis naive and maybe have some preconceived notions about cannabis that might be deterring them as well. If you could speak to that.
Yeah, there's, still today a stigma associated with using cannabis. And so some people who maybe haven't tried it before and have thought about it, but they're concerned about, oh no, am I going to get high? Am I going to have to explain to my family members and friends that I'm using something that's still federally illegal? So there's a lot of different aspects that play into that for someone who has not had prior experience and concerns about, just like any side effects in general, which is understandable.
And we've also had a number of participants who have not been able to, fully enroll in the study or begin treatment with study drug for occupational reasons. They may be in a job where they are subject to regular drug testing and are very concerned about the implications of potentially testing positive for a cannabinoid in that setting.
Absolutely. And so I imagine most of that concern would be in a trial that's using THC, correct?
Yes, but some people, as Emily highlighted, the stigma and I think some misinformation share those concerns even about CBD. I think there's still a lot of things that people aren't aware of in terms of just how many cannabinoids there are out there and which of those, do have those properties that might impair their function on the job versus which of those are probably more benign from that standpoint, and whether or not they're likely to test positive, if there's cross reactivity on a drug test.
Yeah, and so that's a good point that if it's CBD only and you're looking at a clinical trial where we can, guarantee for you that you're really only receiving CBD, then it's really unlikely you're going to test positive because at least to our knowledge right now, drug tests that you're going to get at your workplace are looking for THC. So that shouldn't be an issue. Where we run into more of a murky area are the observational studies that we do, where participants are choosing their own products.
Right.
And, so they might purchase something online that says it's only CBD, but you might be aware that there's, quite a few studies out there showing that when they actually go out and purchase these retail products and have them tested, that they actually find THC in a number of those products. So that's where we can't be as reassuring to participants that if they're taking that they really aren't going to test positive in that situation.
And I think that's such an important distinction to make between an observational trial and a clinical study. When we use cannabis products in a clinical trial, these products have undergone rigorous testing. We do have to submit data to the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, to get permission to even use these products in a trial. So there has to be consistency in the cannabinoid content and what's on the label in terms of the cannabinoids within that product has to be accurate. There's no room for that kind of error that we do see commonly in the commercial marketplace.
Yeah. No, and that must be a whole nother set of challenges in doing clinical trials with cannabis is making sure that you're compliant with the FDA and all the different regulations, right?
Absolutely. And that's true of any drug that's being studied anytime, even if we want to take a drug that's already on the market and test whether it's effective for some new purpose, people have to go through that FDA approval process. But when we're dealing with a drug like cannabis, where there aren't any, or not very many previously approved products, and we're often testing new formulations, it's a little bit more of a complicated process.
Yeah, and so sorry, but what are the restrictions there? Like, is there only certain products that you're able to use? Are you able to create your own formulations? What does that look like?
Well, it's changing right now. So historically, for clinical trials, you've been able to get products from NIDA, National Institute on Drug Abuse.
Hmm.
They have a marijuana grow farm, I think is what they call it there, that they've had since the 70s. And so they offered cigarettes before. I don't even know if that's going to be a thing anymore. Or you can get plant material for vaporization, and then in the last, I don't know, 5 or so years, have extracts that are available that you can compound into various materials. Um, but then more recently, they've approved some external sites that are going to be approved to that. We don't have experience interacting with those entities quite yet. So it has been, yeah, very limited what we can use in these studies.
But either way, regardless of the supplier of the cannabis product, we have to go through this rigorous testing process. So whether we formulate our own or we use something supplied by a company in the retail marketplace, they have to submit, or we have to submit a lot of really detailed information to the FDA, both about the source of that product, but then more specifically the exact cannabinoid content and other non-cannabinoid content, fillers, binders, liquid solvents, whatever, that are in that product that's going to go into a human participant.
Mm.
The biggest challenge with running cannabis clinical trials isn't necessarily at the FDA level. It comes from the fact that if you are going to use a product that is not classified as hemp, then you're dealing with the regulations imposed by the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, and that introduces a whole new level of complexity, both not only in terms of sourcing your product, but how you transport the product, the documentation and record keeping required to do so, and to then store the product, the regulations and requirements around storing that product, and then all the tracking and record keeping that you would do in many studies, regardless about how you're disposing of leftover study drug.
Mm.
Yeah,
Wow.
in terms of storage, I mean, for Schedule one, we kind of laugh about it with people that we speak to because we have to have a freezer that's bolted to the ground and has locks on the exterior, locks on the interior. Multiple entities from different groups have to have keys to get into it, so no one person can get into it. Meanwhile, we have dispensaries on pretty much like every corner around here, especially in Colorado,
Oh
and
yeah,
a lot of other growing places too. So it is a
Far
little
more
crazy.
potent product. Yeah.
Right, right.
absolutely. Okay, so getting back to some of the enrollment challenges, when I was reading your abstract and reading the poster, both of which I'll put links to in the show description so people can read that. Um, I noticed that when you were collecting the data, you were looking at sort of the enrollment process and where people are sort of dropping out of the application. So could you explain that process a little bit more and at what point you're kind of seeing people drop out?
Yeah, I think we see it at multiple points. So a lot of times people will be interested and reach out to us. And then they think about it a little bit more and they're like, well, I don't know, with my job or with what's coming up, it's probably not something that I want to do. And so we get a lot of people who, after they've been screened, will drop out.
Mm,
Um, and then unfortunately, a lot of times people who actually enrolled and things change in their lives too, where they might get a new job or they're suddenly kind of feeling, well, maybe this isn't right for me. I don't want to be known as someone who's using cannabis. And so they end up dropping out that way. Rachel, you want to explain any more on that?
Yeah, I would say those are probably the more frustrating dropouts. The most common point at which people, have to pause their involvement in our work is at the screening level. We do have certain criteria for who's eligible to participate and who's ineligible. And so not only is it based on participant interest, but it really is based on, safety in terms of other diseases or processes they may have. But more commonly here, whether or not they're already using cannabis and
mm.
whether or not they could use a cannabis product going forward. I think the other challenge that we face with our particular studies, a lot of our work has revolved around using cannabis products for the treatment of chronic pain. And that's something that I treat every day in a clinical setting. But I think it's very different than if you're testing like a chemotherapeutic drug for a life-threatening cancer. I think, in studies like that, there is a different level of commitment to being a participant for a prolonged period of time because it truly is life or death.
Hmm.
And when we're dealing with cannabis for pain, for example, we are dealing with quality of life. And so when we're asking participants to stick with us through about 5 months of follow-up visits as they go through different treatment conditions with different formulations, that's a huge commitment to make. And so that's the other issue we've had is, as Emily alluded to, some participants, that sounds reasonable, and then they get into the thick of it and they look at their lives, and that's just not a commitment that they can make at this time, at least not for this problem that they're having.
Wow. Yeah. No, it's great that you say that because that's something I had never considered before, but it makes complete sense that if you're dealing with a very serious life or death condition, you're going to be much more committed to the process.
Yeah, not to say that people aren't committed to trying to help relieve their own suffering, but I think we all deal with, life's daily demands and challenges, and you have to prioritize. And I can understand why, a lot of our participants have a hard time working this into their lives. As much as we've tried to make the onus on them and the burden on them as minimal as possible, we do still have to have these touch points, where we sort of circle back with them about how they're doing and repeat certain measures. And that's a lot to ask.
Yeah. So it's not even just that, well, it seems like it happens in both situations, but as you mentioned, the more frustrating thing is you've screened them, you've enrolled them, but then they sort of just drop out. At what kind of percentage or rate is typical for that?
That's really variable across studies. So some of the studies that are not ours, but we're in the study physician, it's less common. We more commonly are seeing people drop out not due to, participant burden on visits and such, but more so adverse events. And I would say that happens, maybe 5% of the time or less. It's pretty uncommon. Whereas in our studies, it's been really common. We've had a really high dropout rate. And I don't know if I can say why. In some cases, we've studied really similar conditions. It may be that our trial runs a bit longer because we do have this design where each participant gets the opportunity to test three different formulations of drug in one of our study. So it's a long-term commitment. Emily, do you have any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think the length of commitment is a big part of it. So in the study that Rachel is kind of alluding to the most is the one where we were a clinical trial looking at two different formulations of cannabinoids and then a placebo, and it's a within subjects design. So everyone does all three of the arms, and so it ends up being about 22 weeks total,
Mm.
which is a long ask of people. And so it's just and that's one of the things that I would say is applicable across all clinical trials. That's not necessarily unique to cannabis studies, but just something that's difficult with all clinical trials. Um, I think what we face more of being, unique to us is a lot of times during recruitment when we're enrolling these participants, while, we appreciate that people are using a cannabis product and find that it's working, when they come to us and they want to enroll in a study and they're already regularly using, some sort of a cannabinoid product to treat their chronic pain, it doesn't make them a good candidate for ours. As Rachel kind of said earlier, we kind of want that blank slate kind of person who's not already coming in using it regularly with preconceived notions and tolerance issues. So a lot of times when those people come in, they're interested, and we'll let them know what our inclusion criteria are, and that if they're interested, a lot of times we can, as long as there's a kind of a washout period where they're not using it for some length of time, they can still enroll. But a lot of these people, they really feel like it's working for them, and they're not willing to come off of it in order to enroll in the study, or they'll say, well, I'll do that, but only if I can for sure get the active cannabinoid product when I'm in the study, which, obviously when you're doing a randomized clinical trial, that's not something that we can do. And then with the study that we're talking about, where we're guaranteeing that they're going to get a placebo at some point in time. So it makes it challenging at that point.
I think that placebo versus active drug is again a universal challenge across studies.
Mm.
But what's unique to the cannabis space is what Emily highlighted, which is patients often have prior experience with this. And so they sort of have an expectation about what they're going to get. And they already know sort of how it works for them. And so they're a lot less willing to accept that potentially inactive treatment condition.
Yeah, no, it sounds like you're really looking for a bit of a unicorn here, where it's someone who is open to using cannabis, but not currently using cannabis, right?
Exactly right. That's the sweet spot. So somebody who doesn't have a lot of biases against it and is open to the idea of it, but at the same time hasn't yet taken the initiative to try it on their own. And I think that's the challenge we face in the changing legal environment, particularly in Colorado, where, we've had access to recreational cannabis since, was it 2011, 2012? I'm sorry, to medical cannabis and then recreational cannabis since 2018. There's a large population of people in Colorado who already are using cannabis. I think when I looked at one set of data, I think it's almost 20% of Colorado adults have used cannabis at least once in the past month. So those blank slate people are indeed somewhat few and far between around here. And that may be a different set of circumstances in a state where they don't have recreational cannabis. I think it'd be really interesting, and that would potentially be a next step for us, is to compare our screen fills and experiences with those of people doing similar research in other states where maybe cannabis is not as accessible as it is here in Colorado.
Excellent. Now, so you mentioned that you presented this as a poster at ICRS, and I'm curious, what was the reaction of the attendees there? Was there a lot of commiserating about the challenges? Emily?
Yeah, I think so. So unfortunately, Rachel and I were both not able to attend the meeting this year. I was really disappointed. But we had several colleagues who went and presented on our behalf, and they said they did get a lot of foot traffic at the poster, and people were agreeing with it and saying they had experienced similar challenges, and um, really kind of disagreed with everything, conversations that they had on what we were trying to do and what they had done, and really just sort of commiserating, I think, as you had said, to on how it is, and that we need to hopefully, can put our heads together and see what we can do and just try to move forward as best we can and kind of know that these are limitations that we're going to face.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of the solutions or strategies that were discussed in the poster. It mentions community engagement and education as a possible solution for some of these challenges. So what might that look like?
Yeah, I think there's a few different ways. One group that we've pretty recently become familiar with, they do what they call research roadshows around in Colorado. So they'll go to different communities and give researchers the opportunity to have a table, a booth set up, and you can have information about studies that you're doing and be able to educate different communities who may not really know much about what you're doing clinical trial wise and tell them about what are the safeguards in place and what we're doing and give them that education on why we're doing it, what we're doing, where we're sourcing products, that type of thing, and kind of engaging the community in that way is something that we're looking into doing now. That's a kind of a newer initiative that's been present on our campus now.
Yeah, it seems like in order to get more recruitment, it will be trying to alleviate some of those concerns for the people who are hesitant to use cannabis, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like for example, one of the safeguards that's in place is when you do a clinical trial involving cannabis, you can get a certificate of confidentiality from the National Institute of Health, NIH. And so that provides safety for the participants that we don't have to, they're guaranteed that we're not going to have to give their identifying information if there was any sort of legal proceedings that were to come up regarding that participant. So things like that and also to let them know that if they are in a clinical trial, that it is FDA regulated and therefore it's not illegal at that point for them to be using that product. So, it at the federal level, it is still illegal. In Colorado, it's legal for us, but participants still worry about that, about taking cannabis. And so, we can kind of talk it through a little bit more with them that if you're in a clinical trial, that you know, it's fully been regulated and there's no need for them to be worried about it from, a legal perspective. Unfortunately, we can't offer that same kind of thing for observational studies where they're using it on their own. It's still federally illegal, but not locally.
Excellent. Now, speaking about federal, there's been some talk recently about possibly rescheduling THC as a Schedule 3 drug. How would that change or help overcome some of these challenges that you're facing?
It's a really good question. We talk about this a lot. So, I think a lot of the conversation is about rescheduling cannabis, and I'm intrigued to hear you say rescheduling THC because that's always been one of my big question marks in these conversations is what exactly are they going to reschedule? Every other drug that is FDA approved or scheduled other than Schedule 1, it's typically a particular molecular compound that's scheduled. It's not an entire plant, which there's over 100 cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. So when you talk about rescheduling cannabis, what does that really mean? But if you're talking THC specifically, I don't know that it's really going to change things in terms of our recruitment challenges. People will still have access at the state level to things. I don't think that access is going to expand necessarily because in order for a clinician to prescribe even a lower than Schedule 1, like a Schedule 2 through 5 drug, they have to have that drug has to be approved by the FDA. I can't prescribe something that doesn't have an approved FDA indication. And so until there is a THC that has the same formulation and provenance as what I'm prescribing to the patient, approved at the FDA level, there's really nothing for me to prescribe. So dronabinol exists right now, and that's a synthetic form of THC, and I can prescribe that all I want. But for me to try to prescribe somebody a plant material or even an extract that's formulated differently, even if it were Schedule 3, that doesn't change for me right now. What it does change on the research side of things is potentially expanding opportunities for development of those drugs. So as Emily alluded to, there have already been changes in terms of the farms and facilities that can grow and source cannabis for research purposes. So that has happened on paper in terms of how many new sources of cannabis for research are truly accessible For investigators, it's still pretty limited. And if it were Schedule 3, that may expand because what it really changes is a lot of the rules and regulations around the storage and transportation of those products. The other thing that would be different for us, right now with it being Schedule 1, we can't dispense that product to our participants through the standard research pharmacy that most other clinical trials use. We have to have a dedicated pharmacist for our Schedule 1 studies. And as Emily said, this crazy Schedule 1 secure facility to store those products. If it were Schedule 3, that becomes a lot less burdensome for places that don't, institutions that don't already have all of that security in place. They no longer need it. They can use the same protocols that they would use for other studies of Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 or other scheduled drugs to store and dispense their study drug. So that would definitely simplify both like from an infrastructure level as well as a staffing level, the ability to do those studies.
On the flip side, though, in terms of FDA, even if you're doing a clinical trial, it doesn't matter if it's Schedule 1 or which schedule it is, you're going to have to apply to the FDA for an investigational new drug application when you do these studies, which is it's a big amount of work that you have to do to put these applications together and then maintain them over time. So that wouldn't change, which is, one of the big hoops that we have to jump through for doing clinical trials.
But in terms of patient recruitment, though, might it be helpful if there's news out there that it's been rescheduled, it's being deemed less harmful? Would that maybe open people up to being more receptive to doing some of these clinical trials?
I would hope so and think so for those unicorns you've alluded to who might be open to the idea of cannabis but haven't yet tried it. They might be even more willing to try it in a clinical setting. And then for those people who haven't historically been open to the idea of cannabis, yeah, it definitely might make them feel more comfortable with that as a potential therapy for whatever condition they're trying to treat.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so winding down here, I was wanted to ask you if you have any advice to give researchers who are maybe starting their first cannabis study, who may underestimate some of these recruitment hurdles.
Boy, I mean, so
I, One thing I was going to say, Rachel, that we have talked about is one thing we didn't realize when we were, first going through some of the recruitment, different platforms on trying to reach out to people. Social media is a really big way to get to people these days. And we've run into the fact that if you have anything that you put out there that has cannabis or cannabinoid or even opioids and it gets flagged and they reject you being able to post anything on that. And so that's something we didn't realize going into this process. And so we've had to be somewhat creative with the recruitment people that we've worked with and, are you interested in using an alternative product or a natural derived product? And then, of course, once the person reaches out, then we talk to them more about what exactly is involved and what kind of product that we're using. But that was something that we didn't expect going into this, that we were going to run into that as being a really big hurdle for advertising recruitment wise.
yeah, so being able to reach people with sort of accurate information about what it is you're asking them to participate in has been a huge challenge. But then the flip side, really, in places like Colorado, California, a number of others where recreational cannabis is widely available, I think really being prepared for a large number of interested participants already using that. And so either having a protocol in place that allows for participants to voluntarily, pause their regular use of that, or being flexible. When we write research protocols, they're not necessarily set in stone. They get amended and edited as the research is ongoing. And so on a number of protocols that I've been a part of, we're kind of tweaking some of those enrollment criteria and saying, okay, well, maybe we can allow them to use, cannabis once a month or once a week. We don't want the people who are using it daily, but maybe if they've used it in the past month or past year, maybe that's not as exclusionary as we originally envisioned when we wrote the protocol, just because we find that, we just can't enroll anybody. And maybe we also find that it doesn't make a big difference. So each time we make those tweaks, we have to go back through the approval process with our local investigational review board. But that has been another solution. So just being prepared to be flexible as your recruitment is ongoing.
Excellent. All right, so winding down here or finishing up here, I did want to give you both the opportunity to share any other resources or talk about any other studies that you're working on as well. I mentioned that I'll be putting the poster and the abstract in the show notes, but if there's other information that you think would be interesting for the listeners and viewers to learn more about you and the work that you're doing, please plug away and I'll be happy to put it in there.
So we have two studies that we're recruiting for actively right now and more in the pipeline, and they're pretty different. They both are looking at using cannabis as a treatment for chronic pain, but one of them is an observational trial or study in which we don't prescribe anything. We just kind of follow people as they begin using topical, so creams, balms, salves, cannabis products to treat joint and muscle pain. And we just sort of record their experiences and do a few measures as they go along. And then the other one, we're recruiting people into a true randomized controlled trial, the one that Emily described, looking for people who have chronic spine pain who are interested in using an oral cannabis product to try to relieve that pain, and knowing that they'll get three different treatments throughout their participation. So a THC oral solution, a THC CBD combined solution, and then a placebo solution.
Yeah, so those of you in Colorado, reach out to us if you're in the Denver area and interested in either of those.
Now, for the observational, are you able to enroll people outside of the state, or does it all have to be in Colorado?
Unfortunately, it has to be in Colorado because we're
Mm.
taking blood samples. We want to know a lot
Oh,
more about these products. There's not very much known about how well they're absorbed and how they really affect people at a systemic level. And so, unfortunately, we do have to have face-to-face contact. But we are recruiting throughout the Denver metro area for that one.
all right, excellent. Yeah, I'd be happy to put that in the show description, and hopefully we can get some more recruits for you guys.
Thank you.
All right, thanks again so much for the time and for sharing this great work that you're both doing. Thanks again, and hope to see you at a CanMed event real soon. We'd love to have you guys.
That would
Thank
be great. Thank you so much for having us.